We'll start off with one of our genealogical charts to make sure anyone that wasn't here for our marathon session last week can catch up, hopefully. We were right about a third of the way through as far as the names are concerned of the Hamite section. So we'll go back to our Hamite chart. So verses 13 and 14, Genesis 10, bring us to this section of Mizraim. Do you remember who Mizraim was? Egypt. Okay, under Egypt we have Ludim. All of these are plural words, every single one of them. Ludim, Anamim, Lehabim, Naphtuhim, Pathrusim, Casluhim, Caphtorim, and then Caphtorim has one son, Philistine. Then we'll go to Canaan, which has nothing but sons listed, so we only end up with three, Sheba, Dedan, Philistine, three names that would come under the sons, grandsons of Ham. So Mizraim will be looking first of all, Ludim, Anamim, Lehabim, Naphtuhim, Pathrusim, so forth. And then over here, Zidon, Heth, Jebusite, Amorite, Girgasite, Hivite, Archite, and so forth. So let's go back to Genesis 10, verses 13 and 14. We're about a third of the way through with verses here in the chapter. I'll go back to our map of the territory. Now, I've got, of course, more things added on this week. I couldn't put it all on last week or it would clog up your memory on all those names that we had given already. See, we're going to end up with about 71 names here. So now it's a little more congested. Looks like a traffic intersection here now with a few more names. Of course, for the most part, the red ones are the ones that are new because we're going to be getting into Shemites, and the red ones stand for Shem. Now, some of these we had like half of this one. Remember what 20 happens to be? Havilah. Good. Someone's been paying attention. Havilah. Remember, he's the one that migrated back in Genesis 2. One of those rivers compassed the land of Havilah. So it would have to be up here near the garden, but we know he ended up down here. What about number 24 down here? Sheba. Those were the two that were overlapping. Perhaps, there's no way to tell definitely, that we've covered before. And both of these were fairly definite. Now, of course, we won't have any new orange colors up here because we covered all of the Japhethites last time that we plan on covering. But we do have some new black ones because we're about, as I say, about a third of the way through with the Hamites. So we'll leave that up as we begin to go along. Okay, verse 13. Now in verses 13 and 14, we come to all the sons, but they're all plural words, so they speak of tribes of people, of Mizraim, which tells us that probably these names that we find here in verses 13 and 14 are going to be somewhere around Egypt, which is here. And this is where we'll find most of them. If they're not there in that territory, they at least have something to do with Egypt. Now, the Ludim happen to be that third name where we have it appearing one time under Hamites, one time under the Shemites. Down in verse 22, we have Lud, L-U-D, under the Shemite section, which is simply a singular form of the Ludim, the plural, up in 10:13. Now, there could be overlapping here, there could not be. We'll make another comment about Lud when we get down to verse 22 and that Shemite section. But the Ludim appear in several other places in Scripture. We'll turn to these. We probably got enough time to look at these tonight. Isaiah 66 and verse 19. There are some local tribe in Egypt. We don't know exactly where on some of these names, but we know it's got to be somewhere in Egypt. Isaiah 66 verse 19, it's got it in the singular here, so There's no way of being certain whether he's referring to a Shemite descendant or a Hamite descendant or a descendant that has commingled the one with the other. It does happen to mention the singular name with some other faraway names, such as Tarshish, Pul, Tubal, Javan, and the Isles afar off, which I'm just listing this under the Ludim because it happens to contain the name Lud, but it may actually refer to that group of people down there under the Shemites, because there's no reference here to Egypt or to the proximity of the country of Egypt. On the contrary, most of these nations here are faraway places. And if the Lud of 1022 in the Shemite section is a different group, then he is a faraway nation in comparison to Egypt, and it may apply to that. But then over in Jeremiah 46 and verse 9, now here we have a prophecy against Egypt. And so when we see the word here in the context of Egypt, then probably it does refer definitely to that Hamite section. You just kind of have to work your way through and find out what is at least a possibility here. Verse 2, against Egypt. So that's the context of against whom he's prophesying. Verse 9, come up, ye horses, and rage, ye chariots, and let the mighty men come forth, the Cushites, and the Libyans that handle the shield, and the Lydians. This is just another way of saying the Ludim. And the Lydians that handle and bend the bow. So evidently they were expert archers, people from wherever this country was. Then in Ezekiel 27 and verse 10, we have another reference to them, as well as in chapter 30, verse 5. 27:10 again puts it down south rather than up north, where that Shemite Lud might appear. They of Persia and of Lud, although it does use a singular term here, and of Put were in thine army, thy men of war, they hang the shield and the helmet, in thee they set forth thy comeliness. And then in chapter 30 and verse 5 again puts it down south, Cush and Libya and Lydia. Same word there as the Ludim. And all the mingled people and Chub and the men of the land that is in league shall fall with them by the sword. Again, a prophecy that concerns Egypt. So I believe we've got a guess here anyway. It's got to be somewhere in Egypt for we're on number 27. Nimrod was 26, so the Ludim is 27. We've got it half black, half red. That's only a possibility. And I'm more inclined to believe that probably with the Ludim we've got two separate groups of people. Unlike Havilah and Sheba that we've studied before, we've got two separate groups of people, one for the Canaanites, which would mean this would be all black, or the Hamites, this would be all black, and then something else for the Shemites that we'll see when we get down that far. Number 28, the Anamim. I believe that's an 8 there. Somewhere in the general proximity of the Ludim. Then 29, the Lehabim. 2 Chronicles 12 and verse 3. The Lehabim are probably the same as the Lubim in the Old Testament that we see in several places. 2 Chronicles 12 and verse 3. With 1,200 chariots, 70,000 horsemen, the people were without number that came with him, talking about Shishak, who's Pharaoh in Egypt at this time. Out of Egypt, the Lubim shouldn't have an S on the end of the word. The Sukkiim, that shouldn't have an S on the end of the word. And the Cushites. Well, we know where the Cushites are. They're down south of Egypt. So probably we're going to put the Lubim in the same general area. Then chapter 16 and verse 8. Were not the Cushites and the Lubim, or perhaps the same as the Lehabim, a huge host with very many chariots and horsemen. Yet because thou didst rely on the Lord, he delivered them into thine hand. Of course, here in this chapter, Asa is failing to trust in the Lord. He trusted in him before, but fails this time, and he dies as a result. Then one final time over towards the end of the Old Testament, Nahum chapter 3 and verse 9, where it's talking about Noaman, or the ancient Thebes, the ancient city in Egypt. Nahum 3:9, Cush and Egypt were her strength, and it was infinite. Put and Lubim were thy helpers. So this Lehabim generally is identified with the African Libyans, which would be found a little bit west of Egypt, right here. Not exactly where Libya today is. That's really a different group of people, but at least on the border of where we find Libya today. So the Lubim or the Lehabim here, still with a Mizraim location, still with a Hamitic descent. Number 30, which is the last one in verse 13 of chapter 10, the Naphtuhim. Not much known about them, but probably they're the ones right near Memphis, Egypt, which is just a little bit west of the Nile and pretty much south of the primary delta area of the Nile. This is the Naphtuhim. Then chapter 10, verse 14, moving along with the Mizraim section, we have the Pathrusim. This is very easy to identify them. They are the people of Pathros, which is a city in Upper Egypt that's mentioned in several places. First of all, Isaiah chapter 11 and verse 11, Pathros, Egypt. A famous city in Upper Egypt. Isaiah 11:11, and it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people, which shall be left from Assyria and from Egypt and from Pathros. Well, that's a major important city down in Upper Egypt. Cush, Elam, Shinar, Hamath, and from the islands of the sea. Jeremiah 44, verse 1 and verse 15. The word that came to Jeremiah concerning all the Jews which dwell in the land of Egypt, remember this was after Babylonian captivity, and a group of them had taken off against the Lord's commandment down to Egypt, and he's prophesying concerning these people, which dwell at Migdol, and Talpenes, and at Noph, and in the country of Pathros. So it was more or less a city-state that was in Egypt. Then verse 15, then Ezekiel 29 and verse 14, I will bring again the captivity of Egypt, and will cause them to return into the land of Pathros, into the land of their habitation, and they shall be there a base kingdom. So we're seeing Egypt and Pathros tied together. It's because they're found in a similar proximity. And then chapter 30 and verse 14, and I will make Pathros desolate, and will set fire in Zoan. Well, Zoan was a famous city in Lower Egypt, and will execute judgments in No, which was another important city in Egypt. So this is number 31, which would be down lower, right down here in Upper Egypt. The Pathrusim from Pathros. Then number 32, the Casluhim. Not much is known about them, but they're probably up somewhere near where the present-day Suez Canal is. Number 32, Casluhim. Seems to be the case that they were kind of the buffer zone between Palestine and the Canaanites and various tribes of Canaanites that lived there, and the Egyptians, which would have to put them either where the Suez Canal is or perhaps a little bit further up in the wilderness of Shur here, but not this far south. We've got the Midianites, remember, that live down here. Number 33, the Caphtorim, are a positive identification with the island of Crete, which is right out here in the center of the Mediterranean, the island of Crete. Now, so far we've discussed the island of Rhodes with the Rhodaneme, and we've discussed Cyprus over here, but this is the first time we've come to Crete. And that was his ancient name, Caphtor. So the Caphtorim have come from the island of Crete. Now you might want to go back to Genesis 10, because here we have a little textual problem that we have to clear up, because we've got something contradictory found here in Genesis 10 in comparison with a passage in Deuteronomy and Jeremiah and in the book of Amos. If you go back to, well, the Hamite list that I gave you that you ought to have, you'll see that the order is Pathrusim, Casluhim, Caphtorim, and then it's under Caphtorim that we have that one son Philistine. Do you all see that on your list there? That's the last son down. Well, come back to Genesis 10:14. That's not the way it is here. You see, you should have copied that down from last week and already have found that out. Verse 14, Pathrusim, Casluhim, out of whom came Philistine. In other words, out of Casluhim came Philistine rather than Caphtorim. But we gave it to you just the reverse by transposing out of whom came Philistine with Caphtorim. In other words, we put Caphtorim after Casluhim, which makes Caphtorim the father or grandfather or whatever of Philistine. Now, if you go over to 1 Chronicles 1, I believe it's got it the same way here. I'll just have to check to make sure. Verse 12, yeah, it's got it the same way that Genesis 10 does, which is wrong in comparison with some other texts. Pathrusim, Casluhim, out of whom came the Philistines, and Caphtorim. And the Caphtorim should come after Casluhim, because it was out of them that the Philistines proceeded. How do we know? Well, let's look at these three passages that I said. Deuteronomy 2 and verse 23 to begin with. Now here's where we have the Caphtorim mentioned. It doesn't really say anything about the Philistines yet, but we do have them mentioned. Verse 23, the Avim, which dwelt in Hazerim, even unto Asa, the Caphtorim, which came forth out of Caphtor, which we just said was the island of Crete, and the Caphtorim were the people who came from Caphtor, which, by the way, was probably the name of the son, Caphtor, and then the island Caphtor, and then the people, Caphtorim, destroyed them and dwelt in their stead. Okay, that still doesn't tell us anything except that they're mentioned later on in Scripture. But Jeremiah chapter 47 and verse 4, the Caphtorim pop up again. And what we find here in Jeremiah is going to be quite a bit different than 1 Chronicles 1 and Genesis 10. One of them has to be reconciled with the other. Jeremiah 47 and verse 4. Because of the day that cometh to spoil all the Philistines, and to cut off from Tyrus and Zidon every helper that remaineth, for the Lord will spoil the Philistines, the remnant of the country of Caphtor. Notice in the margin that you happen to have the word isle there for country. It's because Crete is an island. So the Philistines, who are the remnant of the isle or of the island of Caphtor, or as it's modernly known, Crete. In other words, the Philistines have come out of the Caphtorim rather than the Casluhim or anyone else. And then in Amos 9 and verse 7. Praise God, I finally get to use a new Bible tonight after 5 years, so I can turn to things a lot easier now.
Hallelujah.
Someone gave it to me over a year ago, and I've been working, well, a year and a half now, trying to get it synchronized with my old one. So don't anyone accidentally take off with this Bible here, because, well, it's better than my old one now because it has a lot of additions added to it here. So I only bring this now to preach, and I have to study out of my other one because you wear the things out in several years just turning the pages in them. So I'll keep this one in top condition and use the other one that's already beat up. Amos 9:7. Are ye not as children of the Cushites unto me, O children of Israel, saith the Lord? Have not I brought up Israel out of the land of Egypt, and the Philistines from Caphtor? The Philistines are known in the monuments that exist today as the great bands of sea peoples that back around the 12th century BC simply flooded the southern shores of Palestine, and they set up a 5 city-state confederation with 5 Philistine lords over them that were very important if you remember back in your Old Testament. So back here in Genesis 10 and verse 14, we've got probably a scribal transposition where out of whom came Philistine was put in the wrong place. Caphtorim should have gone there. So you have to insert Caphtorim back up after Casluhim because it's out of Caphtorim that the Philistine have come. So the Philistine would be number 34. Here's the Caphtorim on the island of Crete. And back in the 12th century BC, there was a wave after a wave after a wave of the Philistine, number 34, that came down here to the southern coast around Ekron and Gaza in Palestine and set up the 5 city-state confederation of Philistine lords here that was extremely important from the days of Samuel to the days of David. You remember David's battles with the Philistines and Samuel's battles and Saul's battles, all 3 of them were fighting the Philistines, so they were a very important person here. Now there's really no agreement on the accent of Philistine. You notice in your Bible you don't have any, and some people call it the Philistines, but probably the accent goes on the middle of the word, just like it has on all of the other words here, with the exception of the last one, Caphtorim, where it goes back on the beginning of the syllable. You don't have an accent here, but probably Philistine is better than Philistines, but you'll hear it both ways. Now some of these names, such as the Philistines, are so important that we can't spend a lot of time on them because, as I say, they're very important from the time of Samuel through Saul to King David. And we could spend, a long time trying to find the references to them and study about Goliath and all of the other characters that would come into their history. So we have to put that all for another time when perhaps we can pick up with some of Israel's important neighbors. Some of these you see aren't as important as the other ones. Like the Caphtorim, really not too important, except that from them came the Philistine. But ones like verse 15, which we start with now, are very important. Probably not very many people here in the church have ever even heard of the Naphtuhim or the Pathrusim or the Casluhim. But you have heard of Jebusites, Amorites, and Girgasites. So verses 15 through 18 give us a new section with the descendants of Canaan. Now we already showed you last time where Canaan was. That's the land of Canaan, where the people of Canaan, known as the Canaanites, lived. And under Canaan, we're given, first of all, 2 sons by name. We know that they are sons because one of them's called a firstborn. Then he goes on to give us people that have descended from sons. So, number 35 would be Sidon. Obviously, this is a personal name here, and it represents the earliest great Phoenician city, which was several miles north of the northern border of Israel. It ended up being about 20 miles north of the future important city of Tyre. But Tyre doesn't come onto the scene until later on. Sidon of the Phoenicians was the only important city of the Phoenicians that was known by Homer, which shows that Tyre had to come around 6th century BC, which is when it did begin to eclipse the importance of Sidon. Now, it's spelled throughout the Bible both with an S and with a Z, and it really doesn't matter which way you spell it with, which letter you use, because you end up with essentially the same thing, whether you put a Zidon or a Sidon. A lot of people really aren't going to notice the difference in your pronunciation. Now this you ought to be familiar with because it's in the Old Testament, it's in the New Testament, but it's way too many places to look up. Number 35, great important city of Sidon. As a matter of fact, the people in the country of Phoenicia were actually known as Zidonians, Judges 3:3 tells us, so that it shows you how important this one city in that country was. Because not only were they called Phoenicians, they were simply called, even if you didn't live in that city of Zidon, if you lived somewhere else in Phoenicia, you were still called a Zidonian, because that was the premier city of the country of Phoenicia at this time. By the time we get to Ezekiel, like Ezekiel 27, that whole chapter is a prophecy against Tyre. And Tyre was 20 miles south. Both of them are right there on the coast. But Tyre was 20 miles south of Zidon, and it became more important than Zidon around the time of Ezekiel. But of course, back here as early as Genesis 10, it's not even mentioned, because there's no such thing as Tyre. Now, it's mentioned before Ezekiel 27, but that's when it really becomes important in the history of the Phoenicians, because up until this time, it's the city of Zidon and the Zidonians that are really important as far as the Phoenicians are concerned. So in passages like Judges 3:3, you'll see them being referred to as the Zidonians. Then the next son, number 36, Heth, happens to be the father of the Hittites. Now the Hittites are one of the great recent archaeological finds concerning the reliability of the Old Testament, because up until this century they were never known anywhere outside of the Old Testament. And back around 1910, I believe, some documents were discovered which gave the names of the Hittites, which were extra-biblical documents, thereby justifying what the Old Testament had to say about the Hittites. In other words, they were a long-lost civilization that had been lost for centuries until this century. They're scattered throughout the Old Testament, the Hittites, but they occur primarily in the book of Genesis, and chiefly in the 23rd chapter. If you'll turn there, you can see where the name Heth and his descendants, the Hittites, are actually drawn together. Here in chapter 23, we're dealing with the time of Abraham, and there was a very important colony of the Hittites around the city of Hebron. Sarah was 107 and 20 years old. These were the years of the life of Sarah. What's unusual about Genesis 23:1? Do you remember from Old Testament introduction? Pardon? Okay, the only woman in Scripture where the name of the lady appears. Sarah died in Kirjath Arba, the same as Hebron. That was just the ancient name of Hebron in the land of Canaan. And Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. And Abraham stood up from before his dead and spake unto the sons of Heth. Very same word back in Genesis 10. So then you can go on down to verse 9. He's asking that the leaders speak to Ephron, son of Zohar, that he give me the cave of Machpelah. Verse 10. And Ephron dwelt among the children of Heth, and Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the audience of the children of Heth, even of all that went in at the gate of his city, saying. So the descendants of Heth are known as the Hittites, that were long lost to archaeological expeditions until the first part of this century, and they were discovered. We're on number 36 probably up this far north, which you see is a little bit strange because there aren't any other Hamitic groups that go this far north. But probably they're right on the eastern border of Asia Minor here. And they had a very, very ancient kingdom back around the time of Moses there. Now, we've got various colonies of them in different places. Of course, we're way down here in Hebron, which is south of Jerusalem here in Genesis 23. So we know that they're living here as well. But the great Hittite empire that was discovered was all the way up here. And no other descendants from Ham made it up that far to colonize the region. Okay, with verse 16 of chapter 10, we're going to start into some of those names that, well, some of which you'll probably be more familiar with, and all of these we'll be finding somewhere in the Phoenician Palestine region. You have a question?
Yeah, I was wondering if Canaan and Sidon are number 35 together.
No, because Canaan, we already pointed out where that was to you before, and we're simply skipping over that right now. Did I give you a number on that before? I don't remember if I gave you a number. Yes, that was number 18. So we've already numbered Canaan. Well, that's what it's numbered up here, right here, number 18. So Canaan's already been numbered. Zidon is 35, Heth 36. As long as you end up with 71, you'll know you're on the right path. It's different than 71. You've got 71 names to go back through and find out where one has been deleted from your list, whether accidentally or otherwise.
For the continuation
As long as you end up with 71, you'll know you're on the right path. It's different than 71. You've got 71 names to go back through and find out where one has been deleted from your list, whether accidentally or otherwise. Verse 16, we come up to these more familiar names. Jebusite, number 37. Again, he appears many times in the Old Testament, so we're not going to look at those references, but simply to say that Jebus was the old name of the city of Jerusalem that was taken 2 Samuel chapter 5 by King David. So we know that the Jebusites lived somewhere around Jerusalem. But you see, here we are with little Canaan. You see, Canaan and Israel just a dot on the map, so we can't stick all these numbers in here. 18 just represents Palestine, Canaan, the land of Israel in its entirety. But then we've got to have like Jebusite right here, and we're going to have Amorite up here, and Girgasite kind of right in between them, so we couldn't possibly get all those on there. So I suppose at this point, some of the numbers you're not going to be able to find up there because it's obvious that they're going to be right here. If they're somewhere different, I'll tell you. Now, if you want to draw a little arrow or whatever you want to do to your diagrams, that's okay. I like mine the way they are. 38, we come to the Amorites, which lived in the hills of northern Palestine. And they were the most powerful of the Canaanite tribes. Remember, we're looking at descendants now of Canaan, which means that all of the Phoenicians are related by blood racially to all of the Canaanite tribes. Canaan was just one general name. I mean, when it says Canaanites, that's just a general name for the people, because we have all of these descendants that came from the Canaanites. And some, of course, aren't even included here in Genesis 10, not by name. They're included as descending from someone here, but not by name. So number 38, the Amorite, would be up in northern Palestine. Jebusite towards the south where Jerusalem is. Amorites were the powerful hill country tribe of the Canaanites, which we see many times in the Old Testament. Then 39, the Girgasites, and 40, the Hivites, both also live in Palestine. It's difficult to say where. Some people place Girgasites maybe a little bit east of the Sea of Galilee, but perhaps it would be safe just to place them in between Jebusites and Amorites. Of course, we have the Perizzites and a whole lot of other ones mentioned later on in the Bible that aren't mentioned here. So they all fit there. I mean, you think Israel was not in for a trial when she came into Palestine. It wasn't the Canaanites, it was all of these various diverse divisions of the Canaanite family of people, these various tribes that she had to fight one after another. Amorites, all these ites, all the termites that she had to fight in the land just to get her portion of promised land that God provided her. Now, of course, he said that you'll have the best when you go in, but it wasn't without a fight. And as long as she obeyed God, Joshua 7, and did what he said, Joshua 6, then there was no problem. When she didn't, then there were the problems that came as a result of her disobedience. But she had quite a large number of people she had to contend with whenever she came into what God had promised her. Verse 17, with Archite, we're skipping into a new group of people down through the Hamathites. All of these are found in Phoenicia, north of Zidon. So the Archites, number 41, the Sinites, number 42, the Arvadites, number 43, and the Zimrites, number 44, are all found in Phoenicia, north of Zidon. Zidon was number 35 here. So they'd have to be found very close to each other, but all here on the coast in Phoenicia somewhere. Now, number 45, Hamathite, that's easy to identify with the city-state known as Hamath, which was, I suppose, right around here. We don't have a number for that. But it was Hamath on the river Orontes, which was the same river that Antioch was on, where Paul's home base and church was. His Antioch was right here, and it was known as Antioch on the Orontes because, remember, there was another Antioch up here that was a different Antioch. So Antioch on the Orontes was the Antioch here, and Hamath was a city that was on the lower portion of the Orontes River, which would still put it in Phoenicia, but it wouldn't be on the coast, in other words. It would have access to water by means of the Orontes, but not on the eastern Mediterranean coast. Verse 19 gives us our second interruption in the chapter. The first one was with Nimrod, verses 8 to 12. And this interruption gives us the border of the Canaanites. And it's very interesting because it is a specific delineation of the borders of Israel that she would have in the future. Now, of course, Israel doesn't exist in Genesis 10:19, so it's very interesting that we prophetically have this reference to her specific borders. The border of the Canaanites was from Zidon, as thou comest to Gerar, unto Gaza. Now, this is their westernmost boundary that would extend from Zidon straight down the coast here to Gerar, straight down to Gaza, which would end up down here. And this is Israel or Canaan or Palestine proper. Then it says, as thou goest unto Sodom and Gomorrah and Admah and Zeboim, which were cities all on the southern end of the Dead Sea, which was right here. Even unto Lasha. Lasha doesn't appear anywhere, but Josephus says that it was on the eastern shore of the Dead Sea, which means it would have been around here. So what you really don't get is an entire eastern border, but you can see the whole rectangular border here. You go from Zidon straight down the coast to Gaza, straight across to the Dead Sea. Then you just follow Jordan River all the way back up through Sea of Galilee, all the way back up near to Mount Hermon, and then straight back across to Zidon, and you have a rectangle which was, and for the most part, still is, Israel today. So it's one of the clearest early references we have to the borders that the people of God would possess in the future. Although at this time there's no such thing as the nation of Israel. It very carefully is giving us a detailed description of the border of the Canaanites, which the Israelites would displace on coming into the territory. Verse 20 sums that up. Verse 21, we start with the Shemite section, and I'll give you a genealogical chart now of Shemites, which I don't think we've had up yet. They're a little more difficult than some of the other ones to branch off because of the number of names that we have. Verses 21 through 29 give us the names. 30 gives us the territory of the descendants of Joktan. Verse 31, conclusion to that section. Verse 32, conclusion to the whole chapter. Okay, Shem, up at the very top, Shemites. The first son over there is Elam, E-L-A-M. You can see the scale down here. 5 sons, Elam, Asher, Lud, Aram, and Arpachshad. 5 sons, and then 5 grandsons. 4 from Aram, Uz, Hul, Gether, Mash, and 1 from Arpachshad, Shelah. Then 1 great-grandson, Eber. Then 2 great-great-grandsons, Peleg and Joktan. Joktan's genealogy given to us in chapter 10, and Peleg's in chapter 11. And then 13 great-great-great-grandsons, Almodad, Shelev, Hazar Maveth, Jera, Hadoram, Uzal, Dikla, Obal, Abimael, Sheba, Ophir, Havilah, and Jobab. So we're only given descendants of 2 of the sons, Aram and Arpachshad. And of the others, Elam, Asher, and Lud, we're not given any descendants. Okay, the Shemites occupy the following areas, basically: Arabia, Iraq, and Iran. What today, of course, is Arabia, Iraq, and Iran, you'll find, for the most part, the Shemites. Number 45 was the Hamathites, the last one under the Hamite section. So the first one under Shemites would be number 46. His first son that's mentioned in verse 22. And that's Elam, E-L-A-M. We've already changed the word children, verses 21 through 23, back to sons. We've looked at the fact that where it says the brother of Japheth the elder, we found out really what that means, who was the elder of Shem and Japheth. So that brings us to Genesis 10 and verse 22. And the sons of Shem, and he gives us these 5 sons: Elam, Asher, Arpachshad, Lud, and Aram. So we're going to put the map back on there now and begin to look at Elam. Elam is mentioned several places in the Old Testament. If you go over to Daniel chapter 8, Elam was a province of ancient Persia whose capital was Susa, S-U-S-A, which in the Hebrew was Shushan. That's mentioned in so many places, like the book of Nehemiah and so forth. But the place where we're told this clearly is Daniel chapter 8 and verse 2. And I saw in a vision, and it came to pass when I saw that I was at Shushan in the palace which is in the province of Elam, and saw in a vision I was by the river Ulai. And then I just happened to remember in going over some of these things today, the text over in Acts chapter 2, where we've got so many nations, remember, that are back at Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost. And you can see some of these with the other names that we've mentioned. Most of them are new. But Acts chapter 2, verses 9 through 11, we have a group of 17 different nationalities represented at Jerusalem on the Feast of Pentecost: the Parthians, the Medes, remember they were Madai, and Elamites. So some Elamites were there. Dwellers in Mesopotamia, Egypt, Cretes, down there in verse 11. That's the Caphtorim from Caphtor, the Cretes. And then Arabians, well, we just discussed a whole bunch of people that ended up down in Arabia. So there's the Elamites there mentioned. Number 46, they're found just due south of the Medes. Here's the Medes south of the Caspian Sea, and here's the province of Elam, which was a province of ancient Persia. And Susa or Shushan, the palace where Nehemiah is seen, and Daniel and a lot of other characters in the Old Testament, is down here. One of the ones that's further east in comparison to the rest of them, but still a Shemite group. 47, you might want to turn back to chapter 10 to take a quick look at 47, which is Ashur, but if you remember back in verse 11, out of that land Ashur went forth and builded Nineveh. But Ashur really comes down here solely under the Shemites. He's not found under the Hamites. And of course Ashur is simply that ancient name of the Assyrian kingdom. So the Assyrians are included back here as well, which would be number 47, the Assyrians. Babylonians a little bit south of them, they're mentioned with the Nimrod section, which we've skipped, of course. 47, the Assyrians. Ashur was simply the ancient name for that. Then 48 is where you have to change Arphaxad to Arpachshad, which was north of Assyria, all the way up here, number 48. And he's just misspelled a whole bunch of places, so you can either leave it like you've got it in your Bible or try to scribble in the more correct word, because he's seen again over in chapter 11. Then the fourth son of Shem, Lud. Now, remember the Ludim were mentioned under the Hamites, but it is certainly possible there's an ancient part of Asia Minor, which would be near Javan, towards this area, the northwestern part of Asia Minor, which was known as Lydia. Was known as Lydia even over New Testament days to some extent. It was just a place known as Lydia. And so it's very possible that this number 49, Lud, or the Ludim, rather than tying them in with the Lud down here, which is where the Hamite Lud group ended up, it's very possible, since we're keeping some of these names up to the north, that this Shemite Ludim group could be all the way from northwestern Asia Minor. There's no way of telling. Either they're from northwestern Asia Minor, or they're from down here in Egypt with the Hamite section where they mingle together. Number 50 is Aram. Aram is that large elevated country northeast of Palestine. It's always mistranslated Syria in the Old Testament. It's simply the word Aram in the Hebrew, A-R-A-M. And rather than Syria, we have Aram. Rather than the Syrians, we have the Arameans, and we get from them the language Aramaic, which was the cultural language of the empire. If you remember our studies, delayed studies, suspended studies in biblical literature, Aramaic was the language that not only the people in Palestine could speak, but the Babylonians as well. Because whenever Sennacherib comes over, he says, don't speak in the language of the Jews, but we will talk in the Syrian tongue. In other words, in the Aramaean tongue, because that was the diplomatic language of the world of that day. So Aram is this high elevated land. Canaan is the sunken in land down here, and Aram is the high elevated land. Number 51 is Uz. Where have you heard of Uz in the Bible? Probably only one place, but it appears three places. Uz, Job. Job chapter 1 and verse 1. There was a man in the land of Uz. It also appears in Jeremiah 25:20 and Lamentations 4:21. Uz, number 51, somewhere out here in the extreme northern Arabian desert. We don't know exactly where, but somewhere here in the North Arabian desert for Uz. This is where Job was from. Then number 52, Hull. He happens to be unknown entirely. Some have guessed that perhaps he lived at the foot of Mount Hermon in Lebanon, but that's only a guess, though. 53, we're down to verse 23. We're looking at the children of Aram, Uz, Hull. Gether is unknown. It's interesting, you'll find that many of these we'll come across are unknown. That's why we can get through the Shemite section quickly. It's interesting that, we can locate most of the ones under Japhethites and Hamites, but quite a few of the ones under the Shemites are completely unknown. So Gether, unknown. Mash, it's only a guess, but perhaps Mash is this region right here, number 54. Now in 1 Chronicles 1, you've got the wrong name for Mash. They give you Meshech, which really goes back under Japhethites. So in 1 Chronicles 1, you have to change Meshech back to Mash, because Meshech fits under another category of people. That's chapter 1, 1 Chronicles, verse 17. 55, Shelah, which you have in your version as Selah, unknown. 56, Eber, which we're skipping over. And Eber had 2 sons, and this is where we see the division take off in another area. Eber had 2 sons. He had Peleg. Now his genealogy is the important one, the covenantal one, the messianic one, over in chapter 11, verses 10 through 26, because it's through Peleg rather than Joktan that Abraham comes. He's just going to give us 2 sons here of Eber. Verse 25, unto Eber were born 2 sons. The name of one was Peleg, and he doesn't say any more about him until over in chapter 11, and his brother's name was Joktan. So Joktan would be 58. And we follow Joktan with 13 of his sons, which will finish out the Shemite section in the Table of Nations. Joktan is the father of all of the Shemitic tribes in Arabia. These red numbers that you see throughout here, not the red and the black, but these red numbers that we know of, well, we only have 2 on here that we know of. The other ones are unknown, but they're all somewhere here in Arabia, because this name here, Joktan, was an ancient name for a part of that region. So Joktan is the father of all of the Shemitic tribes in Arabia. Number 59, Almodad, somewhere in South Arabia. Sheleph, number 60, somewhere in South Arabia, where we don't know. Number 61, Hazar Maveth, we know where that was, down here in Yemen. Hazar Maveth, the very end here of the Arabian Peninsula. Number 62, Jira, unknown. Number 63, Hadoram, unknown, or Hadoram, unknown. Number 64, Uzal or Uzal, he's also down here in Yemen. This is number 64. Number 65, Dikla, unknown. 66, Obal, unknown. 67, Abimael, unknown. Somewhere in Arabia, but all of these unknown. 68, Sheba, we've already covered. We'll just skip for a moment to number 70, Havilah. We've already covered. 71, Jobab, unknown. And then we want to close with 69, which is Ophir. This is the most debated of all the names found here in chapter 10. So we want to close with it and look at several texts. The Old Testament references speak of Ophir as being a place famous for its gold. I want to give you these passages. 1 Kings 9:28, 1 Kings 10:11, 1 Chronicles 29:4, 2 Chronicles 8:18, 2 Chronicles 9:10, Job 22:24, Job 28:16, Psalm 45:9, Isaiah 13:12. Now there are 4 guesses on where Ophir is. It's either down here in Africa, It's on the southwestern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, the southeastern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, or it's way over here off the map in India. Why the confusion? Because it generally is mentioned in connection with sailing and with ships. In other words, the way that you got there was to sail to get there. And you go back and study those passages in Kings, and here at Ezion Geber in Solomon's port on the Gulf of Aqaba, he's always making trips with other people to this particular place called Ophir. So we know that he's sailing somewhere down the Red Sea to get there. It's simply that no one has any idea where it is. There are good authorities for Africa, and you just read them and you see the names that support it, and you're positive it's in Africa. And then you turn to those names that support India, and we've got great archaeological fathers that will support the India theory. And then you've got a lot of great fathers, archaeological fathers, that will support either southwestern or southeastern tip of Arabia. And anyone's guess is as good as anyone else's until something else comes up. But it's somewhere that they had to travel a great way by ship in order to get there and bring back gold and silver and a lot of other things. Now, one thing there in the passage, I believe, in 1 Kings 10, around verse 22, it's possible there that Solomon could actually have made trips with Hiram to Tarshish, because ships of Tarshish are mentioned, but it's more probable that the ships there called Tarshish are simply named that, not because they're going to Tarshish, but because they've been built by the Phoenicians, and of course they were the ones famous for building the ships of Tarshish, which means that really Solomon wouldn't have been taking off from this area, although it's possible. But since we know in Scripture, the passage I just gave you, we know their 1 Kings passages, he had a port here at Ezion Geber. Although the ships are called ships of Tarshish, they're probably named that because that's what great ships were named of that day. But he was still traveling down this way to get to Ophir, wherever that was. That brings us to verse 30. Their dwelling was from Mesha as thou goest unto Sephar, a mount of the east. We don't know where either one of those places are, but probably it's simply giving us a stretch from one side of the Arabian Peninsula to the other side, to the eastern side, wherever this Mount Sephar would be. Then verses 31, 32 close out the chapter. So when we look here in Genesis 10, we have 71 names. As we've gone through the Japhethites, the Hamites, the Shemites, we have 71 names. And when we count Nimrod out, verses 8 to 12, which seem to be the most likely thing to do since he is a complete exception in himself here in this chapter, then we end up with a very important biblical figure, and that is 70. Now, a lot of people have guessed at how many people we have here. Do you include Noah, Shem, Ham, Japheth? Then, of course, you get more. If you include Nimrod, then you get more. Do you double all the Havilah, Ludim, and so forth? There's been a lot of guesses, but if you do what I just said, you take Nimrod out of the list that we have given you, then you end up with 70 names. And of course, these would represent 70 nations. And if you look over in Exodus chapter 1, it seems to be the case that there is a specific parallel that's being drawn here between the nation, singular, of Israel and all the nations of Genesis 10. Do you remember how many souls came out of the loins of Jacob? 70. Exodus chapter 1, verse 5. Just happens that it's the exact same figure. And all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls, for Joseph was in Egypt already. Now, if it's true that, and we have no way of proving that a particular parallel is being drawn here between the conglomerate of the nations in Genesis 10, 70 of them, and God's particular care of one particular one, Israel, there's no way to prove that, but if that happens to be the case, then back to Deuteronomy 32, which we've already looked at. Verse 8, maybe this makes a little more sense to you now. Studying the numbers of the Bible is a whole class in itself, because God, as you know, deals with specific numbers: 7, 10, 12, 6, 6, 6, even 3 of those together, 3 in the Trinity, 1, the unity of God, 70, 40. How many times does 40 appear in the Bible? 40 years, 40 days fasting. Just a lot of different times 40 appears. So numbers are important in the Bible. They do have specific meanings along with them. And perhaps there is a parallel being drawn here between the nations and God's concern for Israel. Remember the days of old. Consider the years of many generations. Ask thy father, and he will show thee, thy elders, and they will tell thee. When the Most High divided to the 70 nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people according to the 70 souls that would come out of Jacob. Which is what you'd end up with here if you end up with 70 nations in Genesis 10 and 70 souls that come out of the loins of Jacob in Exodus 1. So that probably is the number that he's wanting to get across here. You've got all these names, and when you find this many things together, it only makes sense to begin counting and see. Do you end up with 7 or 12 or 6 or some number? If we ended up with 113 and a half, we just end up with 113 and a half. There wouldn't be any symbolism to that. But when you get a 7 or a 12 or a 40 or a 70 or one of the other numbers that speak of either perfection or completeness or incompleteness in Scripture, then probably it has some significance attached to it. And when you count up these names, since you do get 71, then you have to look, is there some strange name here? And there's one strange one. There's one exception to all the other names. You see, like down in verses 15, down in verse 15, we know that we've got 2 people being referred to. We're back in Genesis 10, Zidon and Heth. So just Nimrod being an individual, we know he's a man in verse 8, is not strange, because so are Zidon and Heth. But we're given all of this interesting information about him that we're not given about others. So it only makes sense to subtract him from the list and end up with the table of nations, 70 nations. Verse 32, these are the families of the sons of Noah, after their generations in their nations, and by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood.